Hello, good day, everybody. Welcome to this section. Right now, I will be walking us through the HIPAA deployment project on Google Cloud, right? HIPAA deployment project in Google Cloud. And what does HIPAA project means? HIPAA, HIPAA stands for Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. I repeat, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. So it is a standard, or let's assume we want to check. So what it says that this is Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996. It is a United States Act of what Congress, all right, enacted by the 104 and all right, United States Congress and signed into law by President Bill Clinton on August 21, 1996. So this is an enforcement. This what so what does really mean? If you I would like to need to understand, right? So this is just like a federal standard, all right, just to protect medical records, medical records. So there is a framework, all right, stipulated to protect, right, to protect what? To protect health records. So if you are building an application, or if you are building an infrastructure to host an application, and that infrastructure need to comply, all right, to PCI DSS standard. I mean, sorry, to HIPAA standard, right? So that infrastructure need to comply to HIPAA standard. So if that infrastructure do not comply to HIPAA standard, is likely that an attack can happen to the infrastructure, and then the health information or people information can be stolen, right? Can be stolen, and that is not an ideal. Okay, so why do we bring this particular section? This project is meant to guide you on how do we deploy a full stack application, right? A full stack application, or a full stack hospital management system on what? On GCP, right? Following the HIPAA, following the HIPAA compliance, following the HIPAA compliance. So, so this particular deployment is actually a cyber security implementation on the cloud. So we terms it to be cloud security, right? So cloud security, why is it cloud security? Is because your deployment leverages on the HIPAA compliance framework, right? HIPAA compliance framework. So you are not actually deploying anything to the cloud, but rather you are following a standard. You are following standard. All right. So if you actually want to go to HIPAA, you can type HIPAA infrastructure requirements. Right. So if you go to HIPAA infrastructure requirement, what is a HIPAA compliant infrastructure? So if you just go in there, you got to you got to read some documentation regarding how to set up this HIPAA compliance, right? Project your environment. So what are the things that you needed to comply to? Now look at this. Ensuring the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of a HIPAA EPH, that is electronic what? Personal health information. Personal health information they handles, right? Identify and protect against threats to the security and integrity of a EPHI, right? And also protect against the use of disclosure of EPHI, right? Use ensuring HIPAA compliance by the organizational enforcement. So now look at this. So what we want to do is that we want to look at the infrastructure overview of deploying an HIPAA compliance project in GCP. Okay, so this is actually what we're talking about. The other session we had, we looked at PCI DSS deployment. So this is actually the PCI DSS deployment in Azure. Really, this is on the Azure side of things, but this time this is what a GCP. So we are deploying this in Google Cloud. So we are deploying this in GCP, right? So just bear that in mind. So if we are going to be deploying this in GCP, so we are going to be looking at a couple of things. We're going to be heading over to GCP and then look at how it's going to be possible for us to be able to do this. Before we dive into the deployment of this in GCP, because this is in GCP that we're deploying this, all right. So before we dive into deploying this in GCP, what is the next thing you need to review? We need to actually review the architecture and see how everything goes, right? Okay, we need to first of all look at the infrastructure and then see how everything looks like. Okay, so just stay tuned. Look at this. First of all, we need to first of all look at, let's say this is number one, right? Okay, so this is number one. This is number one, right? So I'm gonna be like making this bold, possibly yes. Make it bold. Okay. Um, um, all right. So I'm gonna be a little bit changing this. Okay. So this is actually first of all reviewing the architecture. We have the database. Okay. So this is the database side of things, followed by the backend side of things. Because I told us that this is a full stack architecture. This is the database side of things, and then we have the final thing, which is the what? Which is the Namecheap configuration, and that is the actual 4 steps of configuration that we're going to be doing on the cloud, right? So first of all, let us review the first one. Actually, when we talk about this, actually, when we talk about this, we look at the database. So for deploying this in the Azure in GCP, definitely we need a database, right? So we definitely need a database. So actually, we're not going to be running. We're not going to be creating a virtual machine, really. No, no, no. We're not going to be creating a virtual machine, but rather we're going to be using a GCP. We're going to be using GCP database, all right, manage the database, all right, in GCP. That's actually what we're going to be using for this demonstration, all right. So we're going to be using MySQL database in GCP, okay. So MySQL database in GCP, that's actually what we're going to be using to make this deployment. So first of all, we're going to be provisioning MySQL database, okay. So how this goes is that actually when we do that, right, how GCP would do is that GCP will create a MySQL database in another separate VPC. Okay, so having this, that this is actually a VPC, as we all know, right? So this is a GCP, as we all know. This is a VPC, as we all know, right? Yes, look at it. This is a GCP, as we all know. So this is gonna be like another GCP, another VPC as well, all right, in GCP. I repeat, this is a GCP, as we all know, all right. But this time, this is gonna be like another VPC. So GCP, when we create a database, so they are actually going to database. So they're going to say database. So we don't worry about creating a VPC, but this is going to be internal, managed by VPC, yeah, GCP. So what I do that is this is managed, G's internal. This is internal, sorry, internal. All right, so this is internal database, right? So this is internal GCP. When they provision this managed GCP for us, right? So I'm going to be showing you a lot of things. So because the way we did it in the this what's it called again? This it's not actually going to be like the way we did it in in uh in our in what's it called again, in PCI DSS. Okay, look at this. So what we have here is that GCP will actually let's go this way. There's going to be a firewall here really. Okay, so this is going to be internal firewall according to GCP. All right, so look at this. So what happens is that let's review this architecture. This is actually how it's going to be. Um, GCP is going to really, when we ask to create a database on GCP is going to create a database for us in a separate VPC in their own. So we are not caring about creating this VPC. We are not creating this. I repeat, we are not creating this VPC. Okay, but GCP will create the VPC for us and deploy the virtual and they deploy the database in there. All right, deploy the database in there. I repeat, GCP will create what, the database, and what, deploy the what, they deploy the database in the VPC. They will create the VPC and deploy the database inside the VPC. Okay, now let's assume that we wanna make a connection, right, to this particular database through our backend application. And bear in mind that our backend application is relying in another different database, right? Our backend application is relying in another different database. So what happens here is that GCP will actually, what GCP will do is that GCP, all right, GCP will actually try to establish a connection, right? Look at this. GCP will try to create what called VPC VPC pairing, right? VPC pairing between these two ends. Okay, so they are going to be creating what called VPC pairing, right? So what this VPC pairing does is that it pairs between these two VPCs to allow private traffic connection, private traffic flow between these two VPCs, right? That is private traffic flow, right, between these two VPCs, so that the backend can now be allowed to pass through that. Okay. Now listen again. Before the backend traffic can also be allowed, there is always a firewall here. All right. There's always a firewall here. Bear that in mind. There are always what, a firewall here. So this firewall protects the what? Protects the this firewall protects the what? The managed environment, that is the managed VPC where the database is lying, right? So what we do is that we will go and take the private IP address of the backend server and go into the and go into the to the VPC, right? Sorry, to the firewall of the database. And we go in there and say, please, we want you to allow this set of nets, this set of IP address, so that if the database, if the backend server is trying to establish a connection to the database, it will be allowed. I repeat again, and I'm going to be slowing down a little. Now look at this. I said that we're going to be creating a database, a VPC. We are going to be creating a managed database by Google Cloud. And this time it's going to be a MySQL database. Okay? MySQL database. When we finish that, during the time, when we finish that, we get the credentials, and the credentials is going to be here, right? Good. So after that, I said that we have the firewall. In as much as we have done the creation, right? GCP will not allow traffic to pass through. without firewall. So there is always a firewall in that area that we need to go in and they say, okay, we want to whitelist a certain IP address. So that certain IP address is the IP address of the backend server. All right, making a connection to the database. So what we do is that we go and them tell this firewall to allow that IP address so that if there is a connection, traffic is establishment near this, all right? So it will be allowed. It will be allowed. Okay. So this is actually what we try to achieve. But now let's just go into Google Cloud and then create the database. And again, for testing, I may equally try to have, let's assume that I may try to also have a connection. Let's say I want also to test it from my local system. I may have from my local system, you know that my local system is using public IP address, right? So I may try to establish a connection from my local system. I may try to establish a connection from my local system, and then establishing the connection, right? Bear in mind that the database is by default restricting every traffic coming in and out of the environment, right? So having known that, right? So we will likely need to allow our own public IP address, all right? So because we have Workbench here, right? I believe everybody get that for now. So we have a MySQL Workbench. So we have MySQL Workbench in our local system. So and definitely we will likely need to use MySQL Workbench to access the database after creation. Okay. So data MySQL Workbench will establish a connection using our public IP address, our computer public IP address, right, to the database. So we need to identify what is our public IP address, and then how do we do that? We come here and say what is my public IP address, right? So if I ask what is my public IP address, definitely it's going to be here, and I'm going to be getting it here. Look at it here, okay? Everyone look at it. So I can copy that and come to my firewall, and then to this firewall, I will say, please, this is my public IP address. Allow this guy, because I'm going to establish a connection, right? I'm going to establish a connection from my local system to the firewall. And when I establish the connection, what happens? When I establish this connection, what happens? My workbench can be able to establish connection, right, to access the database. So all of us should bear that in mind. But after that, okay, if we need, look at this. Another important thing here is that Another important thing is here. When we create the database, all right, there are two things that we need to understand. That there is always a private IP address of the database server, and there's going to be also a public IP address of the database server. But the question is there is that do we really need to access the database publicly? Yes, if we need to access the database publicly by using our maybe workbench, that means we need to give access, public IP address to that database, to that managed database. But if you don't need it, all right, you can just ignore that. All right, public. So I like repeat, say that let's say we need to make a connection, right, to the database. Okay, we need to make a connection to the database, but making a connection to the database, we will likely need what the public IP address to make that connection. Okay, make that connection using public IP address of the server. So let's assume that this is the public IP address. Let's say 1.2.45.this. Okay, let's say this is the public IP address of the database, right? So if we are meant to connect it outside, we use the public IP address. But now that the backend we need to connect to the database, we use what? Private IP address to do the establishment. And when we have tested everything and everything is fine from our own end, we need to remove this public IP address. But if you don't want to go this hustle, like testing with your this system, you can just ignore that and use a public IP address, private IP address as establish a connection to the backend server and continue your work. So let's head over to Let's head over to the backend to the what again? Let's head over um, to GCP and start this configuration. All right. Okay. Back again before we move ahead. And after, like I said, the database, the backend will need the credential of the database, right? And the backend is running Java. You need the credential of the back on the of the database to make a connection. And I also know that the backend is running in Java. And again, is that also have a firewall rule, right? Firewall rule that allow that block in and out of the traffic. But this time we're going to be enabling port 80, right? Port 80, 80, port 8080, so that the front end can be able to access the back end through what? Through port 8080. And again, we are going to be whitelisting the IP address or the IP address range of the back end of the front end server on the backend level, so as to allow only the traffic of the backend to this. Okay, so bear this in mind. There is a couple of ways I'm going to be doing this. Bear this in mind and follow what I do. It's a little bit different from what we did in the in Azure. It's little different because in Azure we use what? NSG for different backend NSG, but this time we are going to be using a different solution. All right, we're going to be using tagging. We are going to be using what? We're going to be using tagging. All right, we are going to be using tagging to do what? To differentiate the traffics. All right, to differentiate the traffic flow of each of the system, right? So this guy, maybe you can tag it what? To backend tagging. So backend tagging means that we are going to be creating a firewall rule that that will we're going to be creating a virtual machine that will have backend tagging, right? So, and also this backend tagging is what we are going to be using. The tagging is what we are going to be using to create firewall, and say firewall any virtual machine that have this tag, right? This firewall will be applied to it. Any virtual machine in our environment that have this tag, all right, the this will be applied to it. Okay, so with the same thing we'll go to do in this particular place. All right, you say any particular uh this front end, any particular system, that have this tag, right, will be allowed through this firewall, right? Just so when we're creating a virtual machine, we need to define the tag. When we are creating a virtual machine, we need to define a tag, right? So now creating the virtual machine for the front end, the back end, I mean, we will be tagging it with what? Backend tag. When creating the front end virtual machine, we're going to be using what? Front end tag. So that is actually how we're going to be. So let's go ahead and then create. There's nothing like tagging for the database, bear in mind. So let's go and create the database. So this is actually how the architecture look like. Okay, this is how the architecture look like within GCP. All right. So after which we are done with the whole thing, we can now go to Namecheap. All right, because the front end that server we have a public IP address. Okay, the front end server will have a public IP address, and then this public IP address is what actually we're going to be going to the Namecheap and then configure that. So, but if you have configured your DNS zone in Azure, you can just go to DNS zone in Azure and then map this IP address to the domain. I think that's all. That's insert. Okay, so let's head over to GCP and then configure this. So after we might have finished provisioning this, okay, we can now come in and then use our mobile our our workbench to test this particular system. Let's go. So I will come to my this is my digital witch online platform, right? GCP. So I'm selecting a project. I'm going to be selecting a particular project. So I think it's all. I'm going to be selecting the hospital project, hospital folder. So in this hospital project, I'm going to be selecting I'm gonna selecting maybe say I'm deploying that in this particular location. So I'll see I'm gonna be doing that here. So I'm going to be deploying it in this DVV, right? So let's search for let's search for SQL. So when you type SQL on the search, you can see something like manage MySQL Postgres SQL Server. MySQL Postgres SQL Server. This is actually what we're going to be using. All right. So I'm going to be clicking on this. So if I click on this, right, it will take me to the manage MySQL manage database. You can see if you want, you can watch the videos and then understand how it's being deployed in Google Cloud, right? So you can just watch here. You can see that Cloud SQL. So this Cloud SQL is actually what we are using, right, to deploy this. And then coming down to our architecture, this is example of a Cloud SQL. Look at it. This is an icon for Cloud SQL, right? But in this thing, the engine that we're going to be using is MySQL engine, okay? MySQL engine. Now let's head over. So we would like to go down. We will now go to this MySQL and then we click on create. So when we want to create, it says choose the database engine. Look at this. Choose the database engine. And in this case, I'm going to be selecting the MySQL because our project supports what? MySQL. We are not using Postgres, neither are we using SQL Server, but rather we are using what? MySQL. So we click on choose MySQL. Now we have selected MySQL, so we will now come here. Important thing we need to note here is this. Now, this particular one says if you are selecting, you say choose cloud edition. So which edition do we win? We have Enterprise Plus and we have what? Enterprise. If you are selecting Enterprise Plus, the price for it is what? $2.2 per hour. $2.2 per hour. So we don't need that. We click on this one. So we need 1.2 per hour. But let your heart not fly, right? Because some persons looking at this, their heart will just skip. Let your heart not fly because that is a trick on this. That's a trick. So when you come down to edit past preset, right? We select this time we are going to be selecting sandbox, right? Look at sandbox. This sandbox we are selecting. So sandbox is different environments, just like a testing environment, right? So this is a single, you can see single zone and then 10 gig, two VCP and 8 gig RAM. But look at this one. First VCP 16 gig RAM and then 100 gig. Look at this one. 8, 32 and 250. So we are selecting this small one. And if you check this one, I see that the price have changed to what? 0.14 per hour. 0.14 per hour. So the version of the one we are going to be using MySQL is what? MySQL 8.0. 8.0. So we come down to and select what's going to be the ID instant name. Just like an instant name, what is going to be the ID? And the BI might says what? Use what? Lower casing. So we're going to be using lower casing to specify that. Now this is going to be HIPAA database. Okay, HIPAA database. So that's actually, and then we're going to be say if you want to generate password, you can generate password, but we don't want to generate password. So we're going to use what? HIPAA, right? At 123. So we just make it basic, right? But in a normal sense, you need to make it long. Okay, but for non-sec, we just need to do this. Now, policy, do you want to set a policy? Do you want to set a policy by saying set minimum length? You can set the minimum length to be like, we say that the password must be up to what? The same must be up to 12. If you want to set it minimum length, you must set it up to 12. You say require complexity. Yes, it must require complexity. Restrict password reuse. You want to restrict password use, right? You can say disallowed username and in password. I don't want to like if I use this right now, it will not accept that because there is HIPAA and there is what HIPAA here. So this is the username already, and I want to also use this HIPAA, so it's not going to be allowing me. right? So this time I don't really want to put any restrictions at all right? I don't want to use any password restriction at all. So password policy, I don't want to set it, but it's ideal that in a real deployment environment, you need to set your password policy for your database according to GCP, and that this is one of the compliance of HIPAA. Bear that in mind. And I'm going to select the actual region. I also know that sometimes the application you are deploying need to be in a specific what region. Let's say that you are deploying this in US soil, so you need to select the United States. All right, but if you are only selecting in Africa, like South Africa, maybe you are deploying this application for South Africa country, so it needs to be in a South African soil. This is a compliance because the data need to be in the resident country, right? So, but if you are going to be using any other country that is not in the list, that means you need to find a way to have this database stored in that environment. So this time I'm going to be selecting the United States, right? So just bear in mind, you can choose anything. So this time I'm going to be selecting single zone. If you put multiple zone, the price will increase, but I'm selecting single. But if you put multiple zone, this is for high availability, right? In sense that you have two zones. If one zone fail, the other zone will be running. Okay, if one zone fail, the other zone will be running. But I want to choose what? Single zone. If one zone fail, everything fails. But this is for a demonstration, but in real life use what? Multiple zone. So if you want, you can specify the zone. Now let's go down to the show other configuration. Then under the other configuration, you can see they're asking you which particular distance you want to reduce. You can still nail it down to this, right? And the price will still reduce. Look at the dedicated core. If I want to specify, I can just select this. Can you see? It also reduced to 0.1. Can you see 0.1? Which means that we have what 1.1 CPU and what 3.7. So we need this. You can just reuse this one. You can see it have reduced as well to 0.07. So it's okay for us. Okay, it's okay for us. If us to customize it, you can still go down to customize. I think this is the least we can go. This is the least we can go. All right, so coming down to storage, all right, you can select the recommended manner is what SSD, that is recommended. But if you want to go down to select, you can customize it. Let's say 8 gig 8, and see if the price will reduce. The price won't reduce, but the minimum is 10, so no need. Minimum is 10. Now, coming down here, they say advanced encryption. Do you want to increase advanced encryption, like bring your own cloud storage or thereabout cloud key, like that is key management system? We don't want to use that, but we want to use the Google Cloud what managed key. That's actually what we use. So we are selecting it. Coming down to connection, this is very important. Do we want to have public IP address on that? Right? So we can say yes, we want to have a public IP address. Okay, so if you say select public IP address, it's going to create a public IP address for us. But if you don't want it, it won't create a public IP address. Okay, so let's just click public IP address. Now, if you also want to have a private IP address, you select private IP address. It will ask you to select the network you want to connect to it. But we're not going to be doing that right now. I'll show you that later. Remember that we did not create any VPC, right? Bear that in mind. We didn't create any VPC. So now data protection, like remember that we talked about data protection, right? So you need to implement data protection like daily backup. Do you want to have a daily backup of the database, right? Window frame will be towards this range. Do you want to have a daily backup every 7? That is a number of backups we have is 7 by default. You can set it if you want that. Enable deletion protection so that no one can just go to your environment and delete this virtual machine. It's a kind of ways to protect your environment, to protect your infrastructure after deployment, so that no one can go there and delete without your consent, right? So this is actually a way to safeguard your environment. Okay, you can see that we have finally nailed down to 0.07, which is a very good fit for this particular project, because just this is just a sandbox, right? And when we have already done that, okay, let me just review the configuration. So when we are choosing, we choose the word MySQL, MySQL's engine, and we choose the edition. We selected what enterprise. On the enterprise, we selected sandbox. We selected the sandbox, and on the sandbox, we selected what MySQL 0.8. Then after that, we did what we did database, and then we also put the database name. We also created what the HIPAA password. Put the password. We went down to the region. We selected the region, and again, we availability zone. We selected a single zone. Having done that, we equally come down to the machine configuration. Then under machine shaping, we tend to choose, because it was here before, giving us $0.14 per hour. So we want to stream it down. We selected a core because this is just a sandbox. We're not doing much thing with that, right? But this is not for production. This is not for production, because if it's for production, it then need to increase it. Then when we come down to storage, we say that the recommended is what SSD, and the minimum you can go for the storage capacity is what is 10 gig, right? So we equally enabled encryption to ensure that the data that is stored in the cloud is also encrypted. Okay, even Google themselves did not have access to that. Then we come down to the connection. We look at having given it a public IP address. Okay, so finally we now go down to data protection to establish a data